to video number 12. What will we do in this video? Well, we will dissect the psychology industry. And I beg you to watch all of the video, even if it takes a little longer, but it's worth it. The information, of course, as usual, is dense and vital. May the Lord bless your time and help you concentrate and be quick in the uptake. Okay, now as a born-again believer in Jesus the Messiah, you might wonder what the psychology industry has to do with faith in Jesus, prayer, and so forth. Well, there are two main reasons why we need to occupy ourselves with the psychology industry. The first, millions of people out there are hurting. Yes, they're hurting. What's more, they believe that psychology has the long sought after answer for them. I personally know of individuals that desperately want to get an appointment at a psychologist, but have to wait for some 1.5 years until he is available. And second, shockingly, many church folks, pastors and theologians included, also consult psychologists for help, or they refer other believers to those people, because they are not aware of the fact that the living Word of God is all sufficient. In light of this, you will probably agree with me that there is a need to feed the lambs and the sheep of Jesus, both to nourish them and to enable them to minister to others. Now again, it is my prayer that you will share the information presented here, and that is with as many people as possible, to warn them of psychology, which is really a totally unwelcome friend. Now this video connects to video number 10, which gave a general overview on why psychology must be rejected from a Christian worldview. It also connects to video number 11, that's the last one, which drew your attention to some of the big names in psychology and showed you that both their teachings and their biography flatly contradict the Bible. So in this video, number 12, we're dealing with psychology as an industry. In the next video, that's number 13, we're going to conclude our mini-series on psychology by demonstrating to you that and how biblical counseling provides proven and trustworthy answers to so-called mental disorders. Let me emphasize once more that biblical counseling is different from so-called Christian counseling, which tries to merge Christianity and secular psychology, an undertaking that is doomed right from the start. Why? Because Christianity and secular psychology are mutually exclusive, or because also so-called Christian counselors / psychologists are not even allowed to offer biblical advice to their clients, because it is seen as a violation of their professional code of conduct. If any so-called Christian counselor or psychologist denies that, then simply ask him if he is allowed to pray for his client while counseling, or even to lead him to accept Jesus as his personal Savior and Lord. Some 50 years ago, the future of clinical psychology looked rather gloomy. Listen, for example, to a statement given by the president of the American Psychological Association. Quote, "Clinical psychology as it has developed may decline in strength and importance for the next few years." Unquote. Well, the opposite happened. The market for such services has grown tremendously, and not only in Western countries. Listen, for instance, to an assessment of the situation coming from the Malaysian Journal of Medical Sciences. Quote, "The demand is great," unquote. The same article reports a shortage in Australia, and that, quote, In the UK, the United Kingdom, efforts are focusing on increasing the number of clinical psychologists in major hospitals, unquote. And what about Germany? Well, let's compare the number of beds in psychotherapeutic institutions for 2 different years. Back in 1950, there were 500, but 40 years later, that number had swelled to a mind-blowing 8,500. Let's stay with Germany for a moment still. A current medical report takes a look at the number of daily rations of antidepressants that doctors prescribe to their patients in Germany. At the beginning of the 1990s, the figure amounted to 200 million daily rations, enough to treat 550,000 patients for an entire year. All right, now, what about 2013? Did the number go up or down? Well, you guessed right, it went up. Well, it jumped sharply and rose to 1.4 billion. I said 1.4 billion daily rations, enough to supply a total of 3.7 million patients for 1 year. And now some data for the US. An American university assessed the current situation and concluded in an article entitled "The Growing Demand for Mental Providers." Quote, "The mental health industry is growing at a rapid pace, and qualified mental health care providers are in demand for a nation that is clearly in need of care." Unquote. More specifically, the same assessment points the reader to the need for, quote, "qualified family and marriage therapists, school counselors, and group counselors," unquote. Now, one doesn't have to research the literature to discover that we're dealing with problems that affect a lot of people. In fact, we all come across people that seem to be in need of psychological counseling. There's a lady, for example, who experiences anxiety attacks. Then there is the young child that suffers from attention deficit disorder. Another person says he feels depressed. And as if matters weren't bad enough, often people who think they suffer from some kind of disorder go as far as taking their own lives. Here's a recent statistics on that for the US. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention inform us that, quote, "suicide rates increased in nearly every state from 1999 through 2016, unquote. What's going on here? Well, this is how we are going to proceed from here in this video. First, I want to introduce you to a powerful tool psychologists use. Next, I'll outline some major developments and trends in the psychological industry. And finally, I'll finish with a few brief remarks. So, first things first. Now, what is that powerful tool clinicians and psychiatrists use? It is called DSM, which is the abbreviation for a Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The DSM is probably one of the most widely and internationally used classification systems for mental disorders, and as such lists all the known disorders, claims to offer a standardized diagnosis, and makes recommendations for their treatment. Last but not least, the DSM also renders a clear-cut accounting system for insurance purposes. Needless to say that patients expect some therapeutic relief to their problems once the psychologist has correctly identified and labeled their particular problem or problems. The DSM gets updated every couple of years. First published in 1950, the DSM classified a total of just over 100 different disorders, but one of its last editions allows for more than 295 different disorders. That's quite a whopper. In passing, when we use the term mental disorder, we don't talk about illnesses such as Alzheimer's that have a physical origin. Instead, we focus on so-called psychological disorders. All right, so then let us now move to our second point. That is a brief summary of these 7 big developments and trends that have emerged over the years in the psychological industry. Whenever no other source is mentioned, I will primarily quote from this book. Now, this book is a well-researched and thoroughly documented analysis by Dr. Deneen, a non-believing researcher who was a part of the psychology industry for some 30 years. Her conclusion, quote, "Psychology is neither a science nor a profession, but rather an industry focused on self-interest and propelled by financial incentives," unquote. I can certainly recommend this book. It's worth reading. So, here are the 7 big developments, which I will simply and conveniently number from 1 to 7. Number 1, psychology has given us new definitions of normal. Quote, "The original concept of normal as average has been replaced by the psychological one involving pathology. No longer does normal have to do with the common experience of people. For psychologists have made normal such a narrow range that most people today are by some definition or another abnormal. Today, normal is how psychologists think the world should be, how families should function, how couples ought to enjoy intimacy, how one ought to resolve conflicts without rage, yelling, or insults. One psychologist described a good non-dependent relationship between 2 people as one based on equality, the equality of 2 self-actualizing spiritual beings who connect at the level of their beingness," unquote. In a nutshell, friends, we no longer get our definitions for normal or not normal from the Bible, not even from a king or from the courts, but from psychology. Since the definition is based on something completely utopian, have you ever met 2 self-actualizing spiritual beings? Basically, everyone in one way or another is dysfunctional, and that is abnormal. This, my friend, leads us to the second big development. Psychology makes average people victims. Quote, "It portrays the psychological image of a utopian world and defines all those without perfect lives as victims. For if they are not normal by psychology standard, then something is wrong. They have pathology, and according to the psychology industry, pathology is most likely the result of having been a victim. Those who grew up in dysfunctional families become adult children of alcoholics. Those who have less than ideal lives must find a hidden cause," unquote. Friends, since everyone is more or less sick, even psychologists are in need of treatment. Quote, "One study of 4,000 psychologists reported that 74% had been or were users of the psychology industry, with an average of 4.5 years spent in treatment," unquote. Friends, also bear in mind that the number of suicides among the medical specialties is the highest for psychiatrists. Quote, "The psychology industry lures people into victim roles, then offers them the opportunity to change from victim to victor, survivor to thriver, and as well to reap side benefits which seem attractive. Now, there are many incentives for acquiring and even for seeking victim status. And in the short term, there are some payoffs. The tragedies, the failures, the hardships, the health problems, and the disappointments of life become explained, relieving people of at least 1, 2, 3 of life's natural burdens, dealing with complexity, facing things beyond their control, and accepting personal responsibility for decisions and actions. While occasionally they make big news, authentic victims are no big business. They tend not to be good material for the type of victim making profitable to psychologists. Victim, as used by psychologists, frequently refers to someone who is momentarily upset or generally less satisfied, less happy, less successful, or less fulfilled than they believe they should be, and who attributes that feeling to an event which was done to them, supposedly done to them, or merely witnessed or worried about. Virtually any event can now qualify as a person, as a victim. For example, to be declared a victim of sexual assault can now mean anything from having been abducted and repeatedly raped at knife point to having been whistled at, unquote. So friends, as crazy as it sounds, psychology offers average people that the industry defines as sick an explanation of their sickness. This victim role gives the person a number of benefits, one of which is that he needs treatment, as if he had a disease, and of course robs him of any personal responsibility. I find it amazing that Dr. Deneen, who is not a believer, has this to say about children in this respect. Quote, "It would seem that where the common doctrine used to be that children were born into sin, the modern doctrine of the psychology industry is that children are born into pathology and are in need of therapeutic salvation." Unquote. So friends, a child then is no longer a person born into sin, but a victim that is free to do as he pleases. His behavior is no longer wrong, but simply a manifestation of his sickness, which only psychologists can treat. As the quote says, salvation now comes by therapy, no more Jesus Christ. But there's even another twist to this line of thinking. Children are told they are sick when in fact they are perfectly all right. Here's an example. In my last video, I asked you to keep the word shy in mind, as we would come back to it today. To refresh your memory for a moment, one of the big names in psychology, Carl Jung, made the distinction between so-called introverts and extroverts. Introverts he characterized as shy people who had difficulty adjusting to social situations. Meanwhile, this kind of disorder has been dealt with in more depth. So here are two psychologists who specialize in dealing with this problem, the problem of shyness. Writing about their work with shy children, they have this advice for parents. Quote, "Our primary concern is to help you minimize the effects of shyness that may keep your children from reaching their full potential as human beings. Even when children are only moderately shy, they still miss out on valuable social experiences. And when shyness is really severe, living in that psychological prison can ruin a life." Unquote. Friends, who would want to have his shy, that is sick child, live in that psychological prison? Who would be glad to call in the help of psychology, and psychology only this industry can give? Now I know that in some way all of this sounds like science fiction, but go to any school in Germany today and you'll be surprised that they all come with at least one social worker. By the way, did you know that social workers also have an elevated risk of suicide compared to the general population? And it is these experts, who label perfectly healthy children sick, and those that are troublemakers victims also. By the way, manufacturing victims does not stop with children. Quoting Dr. Deneen's work again, Psychologists now translate all of life into a myriad of abuses, addictions, and traumas. And they do this not only in psychiatric hospitals and psychological offices, but in homes, schools, business settings, media interviews, and in courtroom testimonies everywhere. Unquote. And this leads me to the next big development, number 3. Psychology has invented disorders. In 1851, a particular doctor claimed to have discovered a new disorder called drapetomania. What's that, you ask? Drapetomania. Well, it's a disease of the mind that, quote, induces the Negro to run away from service, unquote. This medical practitioner regarded enslavement as a therapeutic necessity for slaves suffering from this mental health problem. He also suggested preventive measures such as, quote, whipping the devil out of them, unquote, and removing both big toes to stop them from further decline in their disease. Of course, this particular disease is no longer part of the list of mental illnesses since it mysteriously disappeared when slavery was abolished. The example shows, though, to what length the psychology industry has gone to explain personal and societal problems. Psychology continuously invents alleged disorders and diseases. For example, sex addiction, shopping addiction, chocolate addiction, caffeine addiction, gambling addiction, computer addiction, work addiction, speed addiction, religious addiction, attention deficit disorder, bipolar disorders, separation anxiety disorder, adjustment disorders triggered by a loss of work or a divorce, etc., and countless others, which has, quote, resulted in the transformation of the ordinary behaviors of ordinary persons into the extraordinary and awe-inspiring symptoms of mental diseases, unquote. Friends, do you remember Sigmund Freud from the last video? Of course. In one of his books, he branded faith as a form of mental disorder, a universal obsessional neurosis. Now let's think about that for a moment. So evolutionism and psychology in particular have tried everything to discredit Christianity and to ridicule the idea of sinful people. And yet, we still see behavior everywhere that is wrong. Of course, it is no longer called wrong because a psychologist is not supposed to call behavior wrong, but just different, which requires treatment of some sort. This, however, does not mean that the original problem of sin has gone away. Listen to what Orville Hobart Mower had to say in this regard. He was an atheist psychologist and professor at Harvard and Yale, and he once wrote an article in which he stated, quote, "For several decades, we psychologists have looked upon the whole matter of sin and moral accountability as a great incubus, and we have acclaimed our freedom from it as epic-making. But at length we have discovered to be free in this sense, to have the excuse of being sick rather than being sinful, is to also court the danger of becoming lost. In becoming amoral or amoral, ethically neutral and free, we have cut the very roots of our being. We have lost our deepest sense of selfhood and identity. And with neurotics themselves asking, who am I? What is my deepest destiny? And what does living really mean?" Unquote. Oh, I forgot to mention how Professor Mower died. At 75, he committed suicide. So friends, the invention of disorders that come in all shapes and forms has offered sinful people, as we all are, a perfect excuse. We are no longer accountable for what we do, but we're simply victims, seemingly in need of treatment or even drugs. I am not in the least surprised that even psychologists have grasped this. As, for example, the book title of a well-known psychology professor and critic of his own profession indicates. The title? The Medicalization of Everyday Life. Number 4. Psychology has gained respectability by its re-medicalization. Friends, I've already demonstrated in video 10 the ineffectiveness of psychology. To sum up this point, Dr. Deneen says, quote, "Research has failed to show that psychotherapy was effective and safe, and of significant benefit to its consumers. Subsequent attempts to demonstrate the effectiveness of specific therapies with selected problems have been similarly unsuccessful." Unquote. Of course, this posed a problem. Psychology had to counter this criticism and to do everything to gain the needed credibility. Therefore, psychology scrambled, quote, for protection under the powerful umbrella of medicine. This movement was most evident in the reacquisition of medical concepts and terminology, the attempts to redefine physical illness in emotional and psychological language, and the attempt to have psychologists either as physicians by such regulations as the Medicare statute or as providing equivalent services as physicians. In contrast to the anti-medical stance of the 60s and early 70s, the psychology industry began to model itself along the lines of traditional medicine. Problems became psychopathology or diseases. For example, the epidemic of depressions. Difficulties became disorders or syndromes, and individuals again became patients. Assessments became diagnoses, and outcomes were now prognoses. A significant contribution to this movement was the official introduction in 1980 of DSM-3, which the American Journal of Psychiatry described as having served to augment the general trend towards the re-medicalization of the phenomena of psychiatry, unquote. Friends, this effort of psychology to act as if it was a reputable colleague of medicine by using the same kind of language, medical language, etc., was not brand new. Quote, "The decision of the American Psychoanalytic Association in 1927 to limit the practice of psychoanalysis to medical doctors served to further its medicalization, its professionalization, and the elite status of its members as psychological specialists." Unquote. Yes, friends, you heard right. If you want to be a psychoanalyst, you have to be a medical doctor first. What strange bedfellows. The psychoanalyst becomes the top guy who can not only deal with medical problems, but on top of that with mental disorders also. Now, one such practitioner I've already mentioned, the one who invented drapetomania, and he was the same person who also recommended enslavement as a therapy. Admittedly, he was not a psychoanalyst, because that line of thinking had not emerged yet, but he felt qualified to deal with mental disorders also because of his medical background. Now check out our last video again to see what kind of experts eventually did appear on the scene. Sigmund Freud, Alfred Adler, Carl Jung, the cream of the crop, the best of the best. That's at least what the psychological industry wants people to believe. Friends, share the truth about these so-called elite doctors. By the way, it is not only psychoanalysis that has gained respectability by maintaining or re-establishing the connections with scientific medicine. Psychology has found some helpful partners in this respect too. Quote, psychology claimed the nature and measurement of behavior as its domain of scientific expertise. This approach provided a subject amenable to laboratory study and of interest to business and industry. Unquote. Now let me go a bit more into detail here. How did psychology get to line up with business and industry, even the government? Now, adding the historical perspective to our discussion, we can get some good answers. Quote, like World War I, World War II posed major problems for the US and its allies who needed both to produce and maintain strong soldiers and strong workers, and to influence public opinion. Again, psychology responded, not only with the traditional massive screening programs to select personnel, but also with services which relied on its experience in advertising, attitude formation, propaganda techniques, and analysis and counterintelligence. As well, it began to do something with which it was totally unfamiliar and inexperienced: to treat psychological casualties. As members of the military, psychologists studied the behavior of soldiers under varying degrees of stress, and their findings led to treatment innovations, including group therapy, brief therapy, hypnosis, and stress management techniques, all aimed at improving the efficiency of normal people under stress and getting soldiers back into conflict. Since these services were provided through the assistance of the National Committee for Mental Hygiene, funded jointly by the government and industrial foundations, many of these techniques were applied to similar problems at home among civilians and workers in industry. A significant shift was taking place. Psychologists were beginning to treat normal people with problems, and not just those with identifiable mental illness. The market for their services expanded significantly, as they defined a much larger group as being in need of treatment. Through the efforts of William C. Menninger, perhaps Menninger, I'm not so sure, a prominent industrial psychiatrist and the director of the U.S. Army Psychiatric Program, the first version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM, was created, which gave far more recognition and emphasis to the neuroses and behavioral problems which plague both business and the military. By classifying problems in this way, the DSM further established them as being the appropriate concern and territory for the psychology industry. Unquote. Now, in the course of its development as an industry, psychology increasingly, quote, convinced itself and others that it held the ultimate, if not yet available, answers to peace, security, and eventual prosperity. Unquote. As you can see from this historical development, the psychology industry, by and large, has gained full acceptance with medicine. The military, business, and industry, the government, and society in general. The extent of this acceptance is scary Yes, it is. Which leads us to our next big development, and that'll be number 5. So, number 5, the big trend. Psychology does not only advise us what to do, but actually defines and dictates what it considers good and desirable. Quote, "It has become the accepted practice to substitute personal belief and theoretical dogma for scientific fact. Psychologists are claiming to know what is good and what is bad, what hurts people and what helps them. And their answers are making people unsure of themselves and suspicious of each other. By authoritatively defining what human actions and feelings are to be encouraged and which are not to be tolerated, they are dictating how men and women are to live their lives and how society is to function." Unquote. The role that psychology nowadays has cannot be overstated. It publicly dictates what are supposed to be the new standards of behavior. And I will provide more details on that in one of my next videos on the truth about education today. Now, if you have any question as to whether psychology really wants to dictate what is right or wrong, listen to the following statement of Sigmund Freud, which he made many decades ago, when, quote, asked about the eventual break with his 2 former disciples, Jung and Alfred Adler. Freud explained it this way: precisely because they too wanted to be popes. Unquote. Now think about this. Freud as the Pope, who allegedly represents God on earth, Jung and Adler as his disciples, as if Freud was not only the Pope, but perhaps Jesus, a secular Jesus himself, and Adler and Jung, his followers, his disciples. Language can be quite revealing, right? Now, psychology does not only want to dictate, but go beyond that. Listen to a modern and atheist philosopher of our days by the name of Alain de Botton, a Swiss-born British philosopher who openly advocates the following, quote, "For centuries in the West, there was a figure in society who fulfilled a function that is likely to sound very odd to modern secular ears. He, and there were no she's in the role, didn't sell you anything or fulfill any material need. He couldn't fix your ox cart or store your wheat. He was to take care of that part of you called rather unusually the soul, by which we would understand the psychological inner part, the seat of our emotions and sense of deeper identity. I'm talking about the priest, the stock figure of pre-modern Western life, would accompany you throughout your years, from earliest infancy to your dying breath, attempting to make sure that your soul was in a good state to meet its maker. Because in many Western countries the priesthood is now a shadow of its former self, a key question to ask might be, where have our soul-related needs gone? What are we doing with all the stuff we used to go to the priest for? Who is looking after it? The inner self has naturally not given up its complexities and vulnerabilities simply because some scientific inaccuracies have been found in the tales of the 7 loaves and fishes. Now, the secular response to the needs of the soul has tended to be private and informal. We find our own solutions. In our own time, we construct our own salvations as we see fit. Yet, there remains in many a desire for more interpersonal, structured solutions to help us deal with the serious issues life throws us. probably the most sophisticated communal response we've yet come up with to the difficulties of what we might as well keep calling, with no mystical allusions whatever, the soul, is psychotherapy. It is to psychotherapists that we bring the same kind of problems as we would previously have directed at a priest: emotional confusion, loss of meaning, temptations of one kind or another, and of course anxiety about mortality. From a distance, psychotherapists look like they are already well settled in the priest-like role, and that there is nothing further to be done or asked for. Yet, one could argue that there are in fact a number of ways in which contemporary psychotherapy has failed to learn the right lessons from the priesthood and might benefit from a more direct comparison with it. My suggestion is that society would benefit if therapists were more explicitly reorganized along the model set by the priesthood, that therapists should be secular society's new priests, unquote. Friends, at best, this philosopher is extremely naive in wanting to promote psychotherapists as society's new priesthood. But then, is it really possible that he does not know that the psychology industry more or less openly endorses occult practices and Buddhism, for example, and thus becomes a religious priesthood once again? It is easy to spot what happens when society rejects the Christian worldview. It throws its door wide open for anything but Christianity. The vacuum that emerges when you remove true Christianity is simply filled by what? Reintroducing and reviving ancient pagan belief systems, as diverse as they might be. Now, let me back this up with one example, at least one. What do you make of a man called Israel Regardie, who lived between 1907 and 1985? Well, here are the facts first. Now, he had a degree in, of course, psychotherapy, studied and practiced psychoanalysis, and also taught psychiatry in Los Angeles. So far, so good, one might say, but what about the following information? In one of his books, he offers a how-to program on how to perform practical exercises of ceremonial magic. Yes, I did say magic. In the same book, he outlines the close resemblance of magical techniques and the methods and teachings of psychoanalysis. One of his aims was to break down what he considered synthetic walls that had been erected between magic and psychotherapy. The evidence, friends, speaks for itself. And yet, if there's any doubt still, I'd like to mention that he also served as Aleister Crowley's personal secretary for years. Just for the record, Crowley was one of the most influential occultists of his time and has impacted the arrival and development of such things as yoga, punk, and modern culture in general. How could he? Well, he claimed a spiritual entity serving the Egyptian god Horus had dictated a text to him, which he then published. The text was meant to, quote, overthrow the slave religion of Christianity and liberate humanity with one commandment instead of Christianity's 10. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, is probably the phrase most associated with Crowley and the key to much of his work. For him, it became a liberation theology in 11 single-syllabled words, with Love is the law, as the addendum, love under will, unquote. Here is number 6 of our big developments. Psychology does no longer limit itself to offering its services to the alleged sick. Today, it no longer promotes cure and healing as its only goal, but much more so the goal of growth and thriving, as becomes clear from one of its influential voices. Quote, "Therapy is too good to be limited to the sick." Unquote. Just pause for a moment to let this sink in. Psychology now openly promotes therapy for the healthy. Aren't we immediately reminded of Martin Seligman's work, which teaches us how to thrive and flourish? Remember last video? He's only one of those proponents, of course. Remember Alain de Botton, the philosopher I introduced to you a moment ago? Well, in 2008, he launched what he called the School of Life, whose facilities can be found in big cities like London, Berlin, Tel Aviv, Sydney, or Istanbul. Schools of Life. What do these schools offer? Well, a number of courses on life issues, such as relationships, travels, family, politics, etc. Now, here is more information on this straight from the horse's mouth. Quote, "An evening or weekend on one of its courses is likely to be spent reflecting on such matters as your moral responsibilities to an ex-partner or how to resolve a career crisis. The school offers communal meals, holidays, and a beautiful shop with fascinating gift vouchers and other items. It also has a division offering psychotherapy for individuals, couples, or families, and it does so in a completely stigma-free way. For the normally reserved British, it must be a first to have an institution that offers therapy from an ordinary high street location, and moreover treats the idea of having therapy as no more or less strange than having a haircut or pedicure, and perhaps a good deal more useful." Unquote. Now, friends, all of this is happening right under our noses, and the church at large is fast asleep. Wake up, everybody! Wake up! Let's look at the final big development. That is number 7. Number 7. The psychology industry has a huge financial interest to keep alive and expand. Quote, "The psychology industry is first and foremost a business intent on selling its services and expanding its market. As such, psychologists are selling the public a bill of goods, making promises about happiness, health, and safety, which they cannot fulfill. Psychologists are in the business of posing as experts in living, claiming for themselves the ability to divine right from wrong and cause from effect. The psychology industry has persuaded society that the good life is possible with the guidance and assistance of psychologists, insisting that people must live by expert advice." Unquote. The industry has a business formula that is so successful that it has been copied over and over again. The business formula works like this. Quote, "Number 1, establish credentials through either academic qualifications or certification. Number 2, develop specialty, preferable by creating a new one, which allows one to obtain the additional prestige and income associated with training and certifying others. 3, use noble lying, as a means to create false expectations and false explanations. 4. Market through advertising, workshops, lectures, books, and media coverage. Concerning the money psychotherapists and the like collect, you can safely say that they earn about $80 to $150 per 50-minute hour. The price goes up depending on location, specialization, reputation, qualification, etc. So that $300 per 50-minute hour is quite possible also. Now that's a lot of money, given that Dr. Dedeen concludes the psychology industry has become a conceptual warehouse of junk science, harmful ideas, and malicious influences. Unquote. Friends, I've shown you 7 big developments in the psychology industry. My message is that as lambs and sheep of the Messiah, we need to stop partaking from the rotten fruit this tree offers us. This fruit kills us because it has no life in it. There is, however, an alternative to it. This alternative is the living Word of God. And the living Word of God only. Period. Come join me next time when we'll deal with this alternative that truly makes you whole again and allows you to prosper, thrive, and flourish. See you then.